It wasn't loud, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. The room went quiet, every eye turning toward me. My wife had just dropped the folded stack of bills right in front of my plate. Her voice, sharp as a knife, followed. "You can't even pay the mortgage. Tell me, what kind of husband are you?" My stomach clenched. I could feel the blood drain from my face as her words echoed through the dining room. It was supposed to be a family dinner. My parents were there, her parents too. Our kids sat quietly between us, fork and knife in hand, but frozen in place. I had hoped for a simple evening food conversation, maybe even a laugh or two, but that hope vanished the second she threw those words at me. The bills spread across the table like an accusation. Past due notices, red ink, screaming what I already knew: I had failed. Her brother leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Well, maybe if you spent less time chasing dead-end ideas and more time working a real job, you wouldn't be in this mess." The laughter that followed was soft, almost polite, but it burned. My father-in-law cleared his throat, shaking his head as if I was a disappointment he could no longer defend. And my own father? He said nothing. He just looked down at his plate. That silence hurt more than the words. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend myself, but nothing came out. What was I supposed to say? That the contracts I was counting on had fallen through, that every door I knocked on stayed shut, that I had been trying, fighting, but the world had decided I wasn't good enough. Instead, I sat there staring at those papers, feeling smaller by the second. My wife wasn't finished. She pushed her chair back, eyes locked on me, voice rising. "Our children deserve better than this. Do you even realize how humiliating it is to beg my parents for help while you sit there pretending everything's fine? You're not fooling anyone." Her words sliced deeper with each breath. My daughter's fork slipped from her hand, clattering against her plate. She looked at me with wide eyes, not angry, not mocking, just confused. Confused about why her father was sitting there, letting himself be torn apart. I wanted to speak. God, I wanted to shout, to tell them I wasn't lazy, that I wasn't useless, that I was doing everything I could. But the truth was, I couldn't pay the bills. The truth was, I had failed. And so I stayed silent. That silence became the heaviest part of the night. I could hear every breath, every shifting chair, every muffled chuckle. My humiliation filled the room, thick and suffocating. Finally, I stood. My chair scraped against the floor louder than I expected. I muttered something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse I don't even remember. Then I walked out, leaving the sound of clinking glasses and whispered words behind me. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. I leaned against the wall, pressing my hand against my chest, as if I could hold myself together. My mind replayed her words again and again. "You can't even pay the mortgage." She was right, and that was the worst part. I lit a cigarette, something I hadn't done in years, and stared at the smoke rising into the night. The laughter inside had resumed, but muffled, as though I was already invisible to them. I thought about walking back in, grabbing my kids and leaving. But where would we go? To the tiny apartment I had looked at last week, the one I couldn't even afford. No, there was nowhere. So I stayed outside alone, with only the echo of my humiliation for company. Later, when the guests had left, my wife found me still sitting on the steps. She didn't yell this time. She didn't even look at me. She just said flat and cold, "I can't live like this anymore." And then she walked past me into the house, closing the door behind her. That night, I slept in the car. Not because I had to, but because I couldn't face the bed we once shared. Lying there, staring at the roof of the car, I felt something inside me crack. It wasn't just about the money. It was about dignity, about respect, about being a man in front of my children. And in that moment, I realized humiliation wasn't just something others gave you. Sometimes it was something you gave yourself by failing the people who depended on you most. The morning after that dinner, the house felt like a stranger's home. The air was heavy, the silence sharp. My wife moved through the kitchen without a word, her eyes fixed on the floor, her face unreadable. The kids sat at the table, bowls of cereal untouched, as though they too knew something had changed forever. I tried to speak something simple, something human, but the words caught in my throat.
That was when she said it. I want a divorce.
Just like that. No shouting, no tears, just 4 words, flat and final, dropped onto the table like a death sentence. I thought I'd misheard. I asked her to repeat it, praying I was wrong, but she didn't. She just slid a folded piece of paper across the table, her list of what needed to be divided. The mortgage, the car custody of the kids. It was all laid out cold and neat. My daughter started to cry. My son stared at me, waiting for me to fight back, to say something, anything. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew she was serious. The days that followed blurred together. There were arguments, of course there were. She said I had dragged the family into ruin. I said she had humiliated me in front of everyone. She shouted that humiliation was nothing compared to not knowing if the lights would stay on or if the bank would take the house. Her parents sided with her. My parents stayed silent, and slowly, painfully, I began to pack my things. I remember carrying boxes out to the car while the kids stood in the doorway. My son clenched his fists as if holding himself back from asking me not to go. My daughter hid behind him, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to tell them it wasn't the end, that I'd still be their father, still be there for them. But the words felt hollow, like promises I couldn't keep. Instead, I kissed their foreheads one by one and walked away. The apartment I found was small, cramped, barely more than a box. The walls were thin, the carpet stained the smell of damp, clinging to everything. But it was all I could afford. The first night there, I sat on the mattress on the floor, no frame, no headboard, and listened to the neighbors arguing through the wall. The city outside was loud, but inside it was the loneliest silence I had ever known. I thought about the house I'd left behind, the creak of the stairs, the sound of my children running down the hallway, the smell of dinner cooking in the oven. Now it all belonged to her, to them, without me. Visits with the kids were arranged like business meetings. Every other weekend, 2 days at most. My son grew quieter each time I picked him up, as though he was holding back questions he didn't dare ask. My daughter clung to me, asking when I was coming home.
I never had an answer. Nights were the worst.
I'd lie on that mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the hum of the broken fridge, and replay that dinner over and over in my mind. The look on her face when she threw those bills at me, the whispers around the table, my silence.
I wondered if I could have saved us by speaking up, by fighting harder, by being someone better than the man I was.
But regret doesn't change the past. There was one moment I'll never forget. It was a Saturday evening, my weekend with the kids. I had cooked pasta cheap, but the best I could manage. My daughter smiled, messy sauce on her chin, but my son just pushed the food around his plate. Finally, he looked at me and asked Dad, "Why can't you live with us anymore?" The words cut deeper than anything my wife had ever said. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I had failed, that his mother had lost faith in me, that money had become the weapon that tore us apart. But I couldn't put that weight on his shoulders. So I lied. I said, "Sometimes grown-ups need space, but I'll always be your dad. Nothing will change that." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. When I dropped them off the next day, my wife didn't even look at me. She just opened the door, took their hands and closed it again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain, waiting for it to open again. It never did. The drive back to my apartment felt endless. Every red light, every empty street pressed down on me. By the time I pulled into the cracked parking lot, I felt like I was disappearing, like a man slowly erasing from his own life.
That was separation, not just from my wife, not just from my children, but from myself. I wasn't a husband anymore. I wasn't even sure I was a father. I was just a man in a small, lonely apartment, haunted by what I had lost and by the fear that I'd never get it back.
The weeks turned into months, and the apartment that was supposed to be temporary began to feel permanent. The cracks in the walls, the smell of damp carpet, the hum of the broken fridge, they became part of me, as if I deserved nothing better. I tried to find work, I sent out resumes, shook hands, smiled through interviews, but every time the answer was the same, "We'll let you know." And they never did. Some jobs I took for a week or two, laboring in warehouses or hauling crates at the docks. My hands blistered, my back screamed, but the money barely paid the rent. Each rejection chipped away at me. Each envelope stamped past, due felt like another nail in the coffin of the man I once thought I was.
Nights were the worst.
I'd sit by the window, a cheap bottle of whiskey in my hand, staring at the streetlights. The city hummed outside, alive with laughter and music, but in here it was just me and the silence. Sometimes I'd flip through the few photos I had of my kids, my daughter's smile, my son's serious eyes. I'd whisper promises to them, promises they would never hear.
Other nights I didn't bother whispering at all.
I started missing visits. Not because I didn't want to see them, but because I couldn't bear the shame of showing up empty-handed. What kind of father brings his children to a bare apartment with nothing but pasta and tap water to offer? So I made excuses. I told my wife I was sick or working. She didn't question it. Maybe she was relieved. Each missed visit widened the distance. Each lie I told built another wall between me and the only people who still mattered. I remember one night in particular. I had gone to a bar near the apartment, cheap beer, dim lights, no one asking questions. I sat at the counter, nursing my drink, when I overheard two men laughing about a neighbor who couldn't keep his wife happy because he couldn't keep his wallet full. They didn't know me, they weren't talking about me, but in that moment it felt like they were. I slammed the glass down harder than I meant to, and the bartender gave me a look. I muttered an apology, but inside something broke.
Because deep down I believed it too.
The apartment grew darker with each passing day, dishes piled up in the sink, unpaid bills stacked on the counter. My phone buzzed with calls I didn't answer, creditors, old friends, even my parents.
I stopped picking up altogether.
I told myself I was too tired, too busy, too ashamed. The truth was, I couldn't stand hearing the disappointment in their voices. The lowest point came one rainy night. I had been drinking more than usual. The bottle was nearly empty when I stumbled to the window. Outside, the rain blurred the city lights into streaks of gold and silver. For a moment I thought about ending it, about stepping out of that window and letting the world take me once and for all. The thought terrified me, but what terrified me more was how calm it felt, how easy. I pulled back only when I saw the photo of my kids on the dresser. Their faces stared at me, innocent, trusting, unaware of the man their father had become.
I collapsed on the bed and wept like a child.
The next morning I looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my face pale stubble, thick on my chin. I barely recognized the man staring back.
I was a ghost, a shadow of the husband I once was, the father I was supposed to be.
It wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't just about failure. It was about the person I had become, angry, bitter, hollow. I thought back to that dinner, to my wife's words, to the look in my daughter's eyes. And for the first time I wondered if she had been right. Maybe I wasn't a real husband. Maybe I wasn't a real father.
Maybe I was nothing.
The journal entries I used to keep stopped. The calls I used to make stopped. Even the will to try stopped. I drifted through each day like a man waiting for something to end, though I wasn't sure what.
And that was my downfall. Not a single moment, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow erosion, a steady crumbling of everything I was until there was almost nothing left.
When my wife finally called one evening asking if I wanted to see the kids that weekend, I hesitated. The thought of facing them, of showing them the ruin I had become, filled me with dread.
I told her no. I said I was busy.
But when I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time, fighting the urge to call back, fighting the urge to beg for one more chance.
I didn't.
I poured another drink instead. That was the man I had become. Not a husband, not a father, not even a man, really. Just a hollow shell drowning in regret with nothing left to lose. It was a Saturday afternoon when I heard the knock on the door. At first, I thought it was the landlord or maybe another bill collector who had tracked me down. I almost didn't answer. But the knocking came again, softer this time, hesitant. When I opened the door, my son was standing there. He looked taller than I remembered, older somehow. His hair was messy, his backpack slung over one shoulder. And in that moment I realized just how long it had been since I'd seen him.
I stammered. What are you doing here? Does your mother know?
He cut me off. She thinks I'm at a friend's. I stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to scold him or pull him into my arms. But before I could decide, he stepped inside. The apartment was a mess. Dishes piled in the sink, empty bottles on the counter curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. I watched his eyes scan the room, and shame burned in my chest. "This is where you live now?" he asked quietly.
I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. It's temporary.
He didn't say anything. He just dropped his backpack onto the floor and sat down at the small table, the one with a chipped edge I'd found in a thrift store. We sat there in silence for a while. I wanted to ask about school, about his sister, about everything I had missed. But the words stuck in my throat, heavy and awkward. Finally, he broke the silence.
Dad, why don't you come home?
The question hit me like a punch. I swallowed hard, trying to find an answer that wouldn't break him.
Your mom and I, we can't live together anymore. It's complicated.
He shook his head. I don't care about complicated. His voice cracked then, and when he looked at me, his eyes were filled with tears.
I don't care about the money. I don't care about the house. I just don't want you to leave us.
The words lodged in my chest. I wanted to tell him I hadn't left, not really, that I was still his father, still there. But in that moment I realized the truth. I had left. Not just the house, not just his mother, I had left them too. With every missed visit, every unanswered call, every lie I told to hide my shame, I had abandoned them.
And now my son was standing in front of me, begging me to come back. I felt my throat tighten. I'm sorry, I whispered, but the words weren't enough. They couldn't possibly be enough.
He wiped his face with the back of his hand. You don't have to be perfect, Dad. You just have to be here. Something broke inside me then, not the same kind of breaking as before, but a different kind, a breaking that let light in. We spent the rest of the afternoon together. I cooked pasta, the only thing I knew how to make. We ate at the chipped table, and for the first time in months I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because for a moment it felt like life wasn't over. Before he left, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a photo, him, his sister and me, taken years ago at the park. The edges were worn, the colours faded.
Keep it, he said, so you don't forget. As if I ever could.
After he left, I sat at that table for a long time, holding the photo in my hands. I stared at the smiles on our faces, at the sunlight frozen in the picture.
And I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, not for me, but for them. I had been waiting for someone to save me. But maybe what I needed was to save myself, so that I could be the father they still believed I could be.
The next morning, I opened the curtains for the first time. The sunlight stung my eyes, but it felt like a beginning. I washed the dishes, threw out the bottles, and started making a list. Jobs to apply for. Calls to return. Things to fix. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, I lay on the mattress staring at the ceiling. But this time, I didn't feel the weight of despair pressing down on me.
I felt something else. Hope.
And all because my son had shown up at my door with nothing but a backpack and a handful of words that would change everything.
I don't care about the money. I just don't want you to leave us.
Those words would echo in my mind for the rest of my life, and they would be the reason I began to rebuild. The day after my son's visit, I woke up before sunrise. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because for the first time in months, I had a reason to get up. I stood in the kitchen staring at the mess I had let pile up around me, Dirty dishes, empty bottles, piles of laundry. It was a mirror of the man I had become: careless, broken, lost. But his words echoed in my mind: "You just have to be here." So I started small. I washed the dishes, not just rinsing them, but scrubbing until they shone. I opened the windows, letting the stale air escape, letting sunlight pour in. I bagged up the bottles, the trash, the pieces of failure I had surrounded myself with. It didn't fix everything, but when I stepped back, the apartment looked different, cleaner, brighter, like maybe it could hold something more than regret. And maybe so could I.
I called my kids that night.
When my daughter picked up, her voice was timid, like she wasn't sure it was really me. But when I told her I wanted to see them, she squealed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. My son was quieter, but I could hear the relief in his voice. That weekend they came over. We didn't do anything fancy. I didn't have money for outings or gifts, but I cooked spaghetti again, and this time I added garlic bread I'd learned to make from a recipe online. We sat at the same chipped table, laughing about nothing in particular. For the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor in their lives. I felt like their father again. Rebuilding wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sudden, it was slow, frustrating, often exhausting. I took odd jobs, fixing fences, painting houses, carrying boxes, anything that paid. At first, it felt humiliating, but when I came home, sore and tired, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose.
Each dollar wasn't just money, it was proof that I was trying.
The kids noticed.
One Saturday, my son looked at me and said, "You're different, Dad." I asked him what he meant.
He shrugged, but his smile gave it away. "You don't look so sad anymore."
It nearly broke me because he was right.
I started picking them up more often, not just on weekends. Sometimes we'd walk in the park, sometimes just sit together in the apartment watching old movies. I listened more. I stopped trying to prove myself, stopped trying to explain everything. I let them talk, about school, about friends, about fears. And I realized something: being a father wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being present enough to hear the questions. One evening, as my daughter was drawing at the table, she said, "I like it here."
I glanced around at the small apartment, the peeling paint, the thrift store furniture. "Here?" I asked.
She nodded, her crayons scratching against the paper. "Because you smile more here." That night, after they left, I sat in the quiet and let those words sink into me. Maybe it didn't matter where I lived or how little I had. What mattered was what they saw when they looked at me. I began reaching out beyond them too. I called my father for the first time in months. We didn't talk long, but hearing his voice reminded me that I still had roots, still had a family that hadn't given up entirely. I even started speaking with my wife again. At first, it was just about the kids' schedules, school logistics, but over time, the conversations grew less tense. Not warm, not yet, but civil. And that was enough for now. One night, after a long day of work, I collapsed onto the mattress and stared at the photo my son had given me. Their smiles stared back, steady and unchanging.
I whispered, "I'm still here." And for the first time, I believed it.
Rebuilding didn't mean I had erased the past. The shame, the humiliation, the failures, they were still part of me. But instead of chains holding me down, they became bricks I could stand on. Each step, each choice was one more piece of the man I wanted to become.
Not perfect, not rich, not the kind of man my wife once wished I could be.
But a father, a man who showed up. When I looked in the mirror now, I didn't see a ghost. I saw someone scarred, tired, but alive.
And alive was enough.
Healing didn't come with one big moment. It came slowly in pieces, the way cracks in ice melt when spring finally arrives.
It started with my kids.
They no longer looked at me with confusion or pity or disappointment. They laughed more when they were around me, teased me, asked me questions about things I actually knew, like how to change a tire, how to cook pasta without burning it, how to whistle loud enough to call the dog from down the block.
Every time I answered, every time I showed up, I could feel something stitching back together inside me.
But the hardest part was my wife. We hadn't had a real conversation in months. Our words had been clipped cold, reduced to logistics, pick-up times, school updates, bills. One evening, when I dropped the kids off, she lingered at the door. Her hand rested on the frame, her face softer than I'd seen in years.
"You look different," she said.
I wanted to ask what she meant, but instead I just nodded. "I'm trying." She gave the smallest of smiles, the kind I hadn't seen since before everything fell apart. And then she closed the door.
It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something.
Weeks passed. The kids started inviting me to school events again. I went to a parent-teacher conference for my daughter, and there she was, my wife, sitting in the chair beside me. At first, it was awkward. The teacher spoke about grades and projects, and we both nodded in silence. But afterward, as we walked down the hallway, she said almost to herself, "She's happier lately, since you've been around more."
I stopped in my tracks. "Do you really think so?"
She looked me in the eyes. "I know so." And just like that, the bitterness that had hardened between us began to crack. I kept working odd jobs, painting, repairing, hauling. The money wasn't much, but it was steady. One Saturday, I bought a second-hand bike for my daughter and spent the afternoon teaching her how to ride. She fell 3 times, scraped her knee, and nearly gave up. But each time I helped her up, brushed her off, and said, "Try again." When she finally rode down the street on her own, she shouted, "Look, Dad, I'm doing it." I stood there clapping like a fool, tears in my eyes, because it wasn't just her learning to ride, it was me too, learning how to stand back up after falling, how to keep moving forward. The biggest shift came one Sunday. My wife invited me inside when I brought the kids back. "Just for coffee," she said, "just to talk." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where months ago she had humiliated me in front of everyone. The memory burned, but the moment felt different now. We talked about the kids, then about work, then slowly about us. I was angry, she admitted, her eyes on the coffee mug in her hands. I felt like you had given up, like I was carrying everything alone. She was right.
"I did give up," I said quietly, "and I'm sorry for all of it."
The silence that followed wasn't sharp this time. It was soft, like a blanket pulled over something fragile. We didn't fix everything that night, but we started. The weeks after that, she let me stay for dinner once or twice. The kids beamed when I sat at the table as though the world was sliding back into place. We laughed together again, carefully, awkwardly, but laughter nonetheless. Healing wasn't about pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about choosing not to let it control us anymore. One evening as I was leaving, my wife stopped me at the door. "You're not the same man you were before," she said. I braced myself, unsure if it was a compliment or a criticism. She smiled faintly. "You're better." Those words carried me through the night, through the week, through every hard moment after. I realized then that healing wasn't just about my marriage or even about my children. It was about me. It was about learning to forgive myself for failing, for falling, for being less than I wanted to be. Because once I began to forgive myself, I could finally let others forgive me too. One Saturday evening, I sat with my kids in the living room playing a board game we had found at a thrift store. My son laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. My daughter clapped her hands in victory when she won.
And I just sat there watching them, overwhelmed by a quiet truth.
We weren't broken anymore. We weren't perfect. But we were healing.
Together.
The first time we all sat down at the same table again, I didn't know where to put my hands. I kept fidgeting with my fork, glancing around as though at any second someone would remind me I didn't belong there. But no one did. The kids were laughing louder than I'd heard in years. My daughter talked about school projects, my son about a game he wanted to try out, and my wife, she sat across from me, not cold, not distant, just there. It was more than I thought I'd ever have again. The food wasn't fancy, just roasted chicken potatoes and bread. But to me, it looked like a feast.
Because it wasn't about the food, it was about what it meant.
For months, I had eaten alone at a chipped thrift store table. For months, I had wondered if I'd ever deserve a place back here. Now, here I was, hearing my daughter laugh so hard, she nearly spilled her drink, watching my son roll his eyes at her jokes, catching the flicker of a smile on my wife's face when she thought no one was looking. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. I thought back to the night of humiliation, the bills on the table, the whispers, the sting of failure. I remembered walking out into the cold, certain that was the end. I thought back to the nights in the apartment, staring out the window, wondering if anyone would notice if I disappeared. And now here I was, surrounded by the very people I thought I had lost forever. After dinner we cleared the table together. It felt strange at first, like stepping into a life that no longer belonged to me. But then my daughter shoved a dish towel into my hands and said, "Dad, you dry." I laughed. I actually laughed as I stood by the sink, drying plates, while my son washed and my wife wiped down the counters. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental. Like the family we had been was slowly piecing itself back together, not with grand gestures, but with ordinary moments. Later, when the kids had gone to bed, I found myself alone with her in the kitchen. We didn't speak at first, just sipped coffee listening to the quiet of the house. Finally, she said, "You've changed."
I nodded. I had to.
Her eyes softened. "I know, and I'm glad you did." We didn't say more than that. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't sharp anymore. It was gentle, healing. I went home that night, but the memory of that dinner stayed with me, and the next week we did it again. And the week after that. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't perfect, but slowly we built a new rhythm. One where the kids saw us not as enemies, but as parents who, despite everything, still cared for each other. Months later, my wife invited me to stay for a Sunday dinner, not just as a guest, as part of the family. That night, with candles flickering on the table and laughter echoing through the house, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace.
At one point, my son raised his glass of soda and said to us.
We all clinked glasses, smiling through the candlelight. My wife met my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see anger or disappointment there.
I saw acceptance, maybe even forgiveness. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if my wife and I will ever find our way fully back to each other. But I do know this: we are no longer broken.
We are together, and together is enough. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, I thought about the long road it had taken to get here. Humiliation, separation, downfall. The visit that changed everything. The rebuilding, the healing. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't been clean, but it had been real. And as I looked up at the stars, I whispered a quiet thank you for second chances, for family, for love that refuses to die even when everything else falls apart.